I'm Julia Lupton from UC Irvine, New Swan Shakespeare Center. And so I want to welcome everybody on behalf of my campus. And so my co-host for this series is my wonderful friend and colleague and companion in journeys, literary and spiritual, and that is Professor Sean Kylan from UC Santa Cruz. And Sean and I co-hosted a similar series last year on Shakespeare and wisdom, and we really valued working together and also bringing together audiences from our two campuses in Northern and Southern California, as well as in locations across the country. So Sean, will you say a few words before I introduce our distinguished speaker?
Yes, I will. Let me just add my thanks to Julia's, to all of you for spending this time with us, whether it's just this Wednesday for this talk or for the whole series. And I want to especially thank and welcome my friends from Northern California, whether you're here for Shakespeare Workshop, which is my counterpart to Julia's New Swan Shakespeare Center, or Friends of Santa Cruz Shakespeare, or members of Calvary Episcopal Parish in downtown Santa Cruz, or Temple Bethel, or Hadeshia Menu. Thank you all for being here and spending your time with us.
Thank you, Sean. So a little bit about the backstory for our decision to focus on the Psalms this spring. Since the onset of COVID, I have been studying the Psalms with two different synagogue groups, Congregation B'nai Israel in Tustin, California, under the leadership of Rabbi Eli Spitz, and Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York, under the leadership of Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. And I'm very happy to see many of my study partners here with us today from both of these congregations. And I want to thank them for being part of my own journey with the Psalms. In both of these groups, we had frequent recourse to Robert Alter's translations of the Psalms, which are characterized by both a deep poetic sensibility and an abiding attention to the Hebrew language. So Robert Alter is professor in the graduate school and emeritus professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He has published 24 books, and most relevant to today's event is his, let me see if I can even lift this, his complete translation of the Hebrew Bible in 3 big, beautiful volumes, and also his translation of the Book of Psalms that many of us have been using in study groups, available as a beautiful paperback, as well as on Kindle. And he's also the author of 2 really groundbreaking studies of the Bible as literature, The Art of Biblical Narrative and The Art of Biblical Poetry. And these masterpieces of literary analysis are being used in courses across the country. And I think it's safe to say that these 2 books have really changed the way in which both scholars and students approach Hebrew scripture. His work is characterized by both technical precision when it comes to analyzing and explaining very specific formal features of ancient Hebrew poetry, but always with an eye to meaning and significance. And that means that each page has deepened my understanding and appreciation of these ancient texts. As one reviewer comments, Alter stresses that the essence of a poem is not in its formal devices, even though he is the great master of unlocking those formal devices, but rather in its representation of reality in images, in metaphor. As an English professor, I love that. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Alter. You're going to need to unmute yourself, Professor Alter, and we are very excited to have you with us.
Okay. Well, thank you for your very generous comments on my work. Now, the Book of Psalms is the one book of the Hebrew Bible that through the ages was perceived as poetry. You should keep in mind that in the Hebrew text, and I think in virtually all the pre-modern translations, it was not laid out, poetry was not laid out as poetry. But in the book of Psalms, you have all these indications of musical performance of the Psalms. There are head notes that refer to the kind of instruments that are to be played. And there's a figure called Hamanatzeach, the lead player, who seems to be something a little bit like a conductor, although I think he was mainly a performing instrumentalist himself. I also should add that we don't know what many of these musical terms refer to. Some of them are kind of self-evident, like say a term like shminit comes from the Hebrew word shmona, which means 8. So it is almost certainly an 8-stringed instrument, but many of the others are a mystery. Now, the Book of Psalms in the Renaissance, as many of you may be aware, was a kind of, I would say, exercise ground for poets. Many Renaissance poets, at least in England, produced metrical and rhyming versions of some of the Psalms. Shakespeare did not, but there were other ways in which, as you'll be exploring in the coming weeks, the Psalms got into his poetry. These poets, of course, almost all of them, with the exception of Milton, did not read the Hebrew. And they, in their adaptations, they're really more adaptations than translations. They exercise considerable freedom and transform the nature of the poems. And there is no reason that they would have had an awareness of the actual formal structure of the Hebrew poems. I'd like to add the following, though. We have to keep in mind about Psalms. It's a very miscellaneous collection. It covers several centuries. Some of the oldest Psalms may go back to the, 8th century, even 9th century BCE. And then there are some that show clear indications that they were composed in the Babylonian exile. It's not only miscellaneous in terms of being a kind of anthology that covers several centuries, but also one must recognize that the quality is uneven. That is, there is brilliant and moving poetry, which has moved millions of readers in translation over the centuries and played a part in the spiritual life of many. But then there are rather conventional poems, some of them, I would say, composed in boilerplate. This is particularly true of the alphabetical acrostics. There's one alphabetical acrostic that has 7 lines of poetry for each of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and it proceeds mainly through formula. Nevertheless, there is great poetry here. Now, I would make one generalization about the greatness of the poetry. There's an odd way in which it resembles Renaissance sonnets, which is that the idea is not necessarily to invent startling or original new imagery, but to use the received imagery in a fresh or somehow powerful way. And you can see the parallels with the celebration of the beauty of the beloved in Renaissance love sonnets. So I'll give one illustration, which is poems about near death. Now, many of these seem to be about being in some terrible illness, an illness from which the speaker thinks he couldn't possibly recover. And then miraculously, his 105 fever breaks and he's restored to life when he thought he was on the brink of death. Some of these near-death poems seem to be about actual enemies. But there, in terms of stock imagery, there is one recurrent image, which is drowning for death. That is, well, you can see, first of all, for people living on the littoral of the Mediterranean, drowning was a certain actuality. And then the process of a person going under is a very apt general image for the progress of death. I'll give you one example, which I think is actually quite effective. This is the beginning of the first few verses of Psalm 69. Rescue me, God, for the waters have come up to my neck. Now, I have to stop here for a moment. There's the King James Version, which has many virtues, also has a good many howlers. And one of them is that it regularly translates the Hebrew word nephesh as soul, which it never means in the Hebrew Bible because there's no concept of the soul in ancient Hebrew culture. It often means something like life breath. That's its primary meaning. But by extension, it also means neck or throat, which is by metonymy, which is a passageway for the life breath. But the King James translators didn't understand this, so they said, for the waters have come up even unto my soul, which is hard to make much sense of. Actually, the line reads, for the waters have come up to my neck. In other words, he's beginning to drown. The waters have now proceeded up to his neck. They're under his chin. He only has a few minutes left. I have sunk in the slime of the deep, and there is no place to stand. I've entered the watery depths, and the current has swept me away. I am exhausted from my calling out. My throat is hoarse. My eyes fail from hoping for my God. Now, you can see that that's a set image. It will appear in dozens of Psalms as you read through the book of Psalms. And yet it's powerfully imagined. You get the sense of a man about to be overwhelmed by the water, there's no footing beneath him, and he's about to be swept away by the current. So a word of praise for the use of traditional set images. Now, what I'd like to do is to walk you through a few different Psalms which will illustrate some of the different poetic virtues of the Psalms. So I'd like to begin with Psalm 8, which is quite short. I'll read it through without stopping and then back up and comment on it. For the lead player on the Gittit, a David psalm. Now, we have no idea what a gitit is, but the lead player seems to have been playing it. Lord, our master, how majestic your name in all the earth, whose splendor was told over the heavens. From the mouths of babes and sucklings, you founded strength on account of your foes, to put an end to enemy and avenger. When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you fix firm, what is man that you should note him, and the human creature that you pay him heed, and you make him little less than the gods? With glory and grandeur you crown him. You make him rule over the work of your hands. All things you set under his feet, sheep and oxen all together, and all the beasts of the field, birds of the heavens and fish of the sea, what moves on the paths of the seas. Lord, our master, how majestic your name in all the earth. Now, to begin with, to be perfectly candid, there is a line that is rather obscure. From the mouths of babes and sucklings who founded strength. We don't know really, there are various interpretive conjectures how the babes and sucklings got in here. Then you founded strength on account of your foes to put an end to enemy and avenger. Now, it would seem that the enemy and avenger have no place in so harmonious a psalm. And maybe it's a bit of textual fragment that a misguided scribe introduced from another text. I'm not sure. But to the extent that it could be justified, it would be the following. Many of the Psalms, and we'll look at an example or two as we move on, are rather mythological in character. And the mythology they invoke is Canaanite mythology. Now, in the Canaanite myths, creation came about when the land god, or weather god Baal, subdued a raging and chaotic god or demon of the sea, who is given various names, including one you're all familiar with, which is Leviathan. And once that conquest of the raging sea took place, the dry land could be safe, and creation was assured. Now, you may wonder, what is a monotheistic poet doing with a polytheistic myth? Well, myth has poetic power, and the Hebrew poets were quite conscious of this. The myths could take them places that non-mythic discourse could not. This is something, of course, that Milton was keenly aware of in composing Paradise Lost. So it could be that the enemy and avenger are the ferocious sea god that has to be introduced, but subdued. But that's just conjecture. Let's now walk through what the speaker sees. I hope that if some of you will pick up echoes here, that is the echoes of the first account of creation in Genesis chapter 1, the so-called priestly version of creation. Now, the priestly version of creation, unlike the one that follows, assigned by scholars to the J source, is of a harmonious procession from day 1 through day 6 to the first Sabbath, each in its ordered place, and each act of creation effected through a speech act by God. So the poet picks up on this. This is really a kind of poetic riff on the first account of creation, rendered from the point of view of an observer. He looks up at the heavens and he sees the work of God's fingers. Now, the standard idiom in the Bible is handiwork, work of your hands. But here the poet chooses fingers. It's a small illustration of how subtly the language is adjusted, because he's looking at the beautiful tracery of the stars and the moon and the stars. And for that, fingers works better than hands. And then this, now man in the P version of creation is at the pinnacle of hierarchy. And that pinnacle, that hierarchy is invoked here, but it's invoked again from the point of view of the lyric observer. What is man that you should note him, and the human creature that you pay him heed? By the way, Job picks up on this verse and turns it on its head. He says, what is man that you should know him? And you, more or less, the context indicates you relentlessly pay attention to him. You don't let him go. But here it's a celebration. You make him little less than the gods, with glory and grandeur you crown him. And I tried in my translation to replicate the beautiful alliteration of the Hebrew, which is Hod v'hadar atarta. So with glory and grandeur you crown him. So we go from the divine creatures, that is B'nai Elohim, which are there in the mythology of the Bible. They're kind of divine entourage. And below that entourage stands the human creature. And then we go to his feet, and from the feet down to the beasts of the field, and the fish in the sea, what moves on the paths of the sea. Then, Lord our Master, how majestic your name in all the earth. Now, of course, this is a refrain. And it's a little strange because there are no refrains in biblical poetry except here. But you can see why it's dictated by the subject. That is, you have a perfect rounding out of the harmonious hierarchy of creation. And we may not all view the world in quite that way, but it's a breathtaking piece of poetry. Now, let me go to a very different kind of poem, just a few Psalms on, Psalm 13. To the lead player, a David psalm. How long, O Lord, will you forget me always? How long hide your face from me? How long shall I cast about for counsel, sorrow in my heart all day? How long will my enemy loom over me? Regard, answer me, Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep death. Lest my enemy say, I've prevailed over him. Lest my foes exult when I stumble. but in your kindness I do trust. My heart exults in your rescue. Let me sing to the Lord, for he requited me. Now, it's a commonplace of Psalm scholarship that goes back a century, that there are these, what the German scholars call patterns, Gattungen, what we would call genres, Psalm genres. So scholars like to classify things. So they say there are psalms of supplication, there are psalms of thanksgiving, there are psalms celebrating God, there are royal psalms, and so forth. However, the categories are not that tight. What's interesting about them is that they flow into each other, as I like to show when we look at the last lines of this poem. But again, I like to pay attention to the effectiveness of the poetic formulation. How long, O Lord, will you forget me always? Now, of course, that's a logical contradiction. If he's saying how long, then why does he say always? Because how long implies a certain duration that's too long, and always means that it's never going to stop. It's forgetting without end. But of course, that expresses perfectly his sense of desperation, how things, when you're in a period of suffering, it seems that it's going to go on forever. And he feels that God is going to forget him forever. Now, in this poem, it looks very much to me, anyway, as if the threat of death is from real enemies, not from an illness, as in many of the others. And look at the riveting expression of verse 4. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep death. He doesn't say, lest I sleep the sleep of death, or lest I sleep in death, but lest I sleep death. And there's an immediacy there that grabs you by the throat. Then the last line, the last two lines of the poem, the verse numbers don't correspond to the lines of poetry. I will reread. But I in your kindness do trust, my heart exults in your rescue. Let me sing to the Lord, for he requited me. Now, this is a psalm, and this is a move that you find in many of the poems here. It's a psalm that expresses the desperation of a person who feels that he's threatened with imminent destruction. And that makes it a psalm of supplication. But in the last two lines of the poem, he swivels around 180 degrees. That is, he is so trusting in God's kindness, his chesed, that he feels that his prayer has already been answered. Let me sing to the Lord, for he requited me. So in the last two lines, the psalm of supplication has become a psalm of thanksgiving, which is a move we will find in a lot of these poems. Now, let me turn to Psalm 30, because this will give me an opportunity to point out some of the poetic means that are deployed in these poems, and what I try to do in representing them in English. First, there's the superscription, Song for the dedication of the house for David. Now, just so you don't get confused, these superscriptions, possibly not the ones that refer to musical instruments, but in general, these superscriptions are much later editorial additions, probably from the last centuries of the biblical period. And at times it's hard to make sense of how they connected anyway with the body of the poem. Not all editors are reliable, as many of you probably have discovered in your personal experience. But kind of amusingly, because the phrase dedication of the house in Hebrew is Chanukat Habayit. And so this psalm becomes one that is recited on the festival of Hanukkah. Okay, let me read the body of the poem. I shall exalt you, Lord, for you drew me up, and you gave no joy to my enemies. Now, the drew me up, I think, is a somewhat flat-footed solution to a difficult problem in the Hebrew. Hebrew has a specialized verb for pulling a bucket up out of a well. And the best I could come up with to indicate that was drew me up, but that may not work too well because there's also the English sense of drawing up plans. But the reason why it's important is because what is a bucket doing in the well? It's plunged in the waters. In other words, it's plunged in the realm which throughout Psalms is the realm of death. But God has drawn him up out of those waters to safety. Lord my God, I cried to you and you healed me. Now, the use of the verb healed suggests that in this case, the threat of death is illness. I cried to you and you healed me. Lord, you brought me up from Sheol, the Hebrew equivalent of Hades, gave me life from those gone down to the pit. Hymn to the Lord, O his faithful, acclaim his holy name. But a moment in his wrath, life in his pleasure. At evening, one beds down weeping, and in the morning, glad song. So this is clearly a Thanksgiving psalm, although embedded in it, as we'll see in a moment, it's again the fluidity of psalm genre, is the supplication that he addressed to God in his desperation, as a kind of flashback. As for me, I thought in my quiet days, never will I stumble. Lord, in your pleasure, you made me stand mountain strong. When you hid your face, I was stricken. To you, O Lord, I call, and to the Master I plead. What profit in my blood, in my going down deathward? Now, let me pause to make a translator's comment. The King James Version, followed by the moderns, most of the moderns, says, what profit is there in my blood? The moderns often substitute death for blood, thinking that modern readers can't understand the metaphor, which is nonsense. But if you listen to that line, what profit is there in my blood? It's arrhythmic. It doesn't sound like a line of poetry. The Hebrew sounds like this, ma betza bidami, this pounding rhythm with 3 beats. It occurred to me that if you dropped out the is there, which is not really necessary, you get what prophet in my blood, which sounds just like ma betza bidami in my going down deathward. And that's what I often try to do in translating Hebrew poetry, which is to tamp down English, to use short words and to try to get rid of extraneous words. Will dust acclaim you? Will it tell your truth? Hear, Lord, and grant me grace. Lord, become helper to me. You have now. The next line, literally in the Hebrew, means something else. You've turned my lament to a dance for me. But the Hebrew is this: Hafachta mispedi lemacholi. That is, the word for lament is misped, and the word for dance is mahol. They both begin with an M sound. And the alliteration donami is quite important because it shows how God can flip things 180 degrees if he chooses. He can take a dire condition and turn it into a condition of rejoicing with the two nouns beginning with the same consonant. And then every once in a while, you get lucky as a translator. And I think I got lucky here. It occurred to me that there was a good monosyllabic word for lament in English that began with a D. So I translated, you've turned my dirge to a dance for me, undone my sackcloth and bound me with joy. Oh, let my heart hymn. Let my heart hymn you, and be not still, Lord my God, for all time I acclaim you. So this is a beautiful braiding together of a Thanksgiving psalm with a psalm of supplication. I will, maybe we have time for two more poems, one of them rather lengthy. So let's turn to Psalm 90. A prayer of Moses, man of God. Now, why this is attributed to Moses by an editor is obscure, as are so many of the superscriptions. O Master, you have been our abode in every generation. Before mountains were born, before you spawned earth and world, from forever to forever, you are God. Now, by the later biblical period, the notion that God is eternal and man is ephemeral had become firmly anchored in Israelite culture. But that's a kind of abstract theological notion. And what's really remarkable in this poem is the way poetry is used in order to represent God's eternity and man's ephemerality. Before you spawned earth and world, from forever to forever you are God. You bring man back to the dust and say, turn back, humankind, for 1,000 years in your eyes are like yesterday gone, like a watch in the night. A breathtaking line of poetry, which slides from 1,000 years to yesterday, and then from yesterday to just part of yesterday, a watch in the night. You engulf them with sleep. In the morn, they are like grass that passes. In the morning, it sprouts and passes. By evening, it withers and dies. Now, this, unlike the lines that precede, is a rather conventional image in biblical poetry. You find it in Psalms and you find it in several of the prophets, which is the transience of life is represented by grass which sprouts up and then withers almost overnight. For we are consumed in your wrath, and in your fury we are destroyed. You have set our transgressions before you, our hidden faults in the light of your face. For all our days slip away in your anger. We consume our years like a sigh. The days of our years are but 70 years, and if in great strength, 80 years. Now, notice how these time indicators are assembled in the poem in keeping with that 1,000 years in your eyes and so forth that we saw before. But now it zeroes in on the lifespan of a human being. And their pride is trouble and grief, for swiftly cut down we fly off. Who can know the strength of your wrath, as the fear of you is your anger? To count our days rightly instruct, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there to leave time for one more psalm. But you can see how the instrument of poetry becomes a way of realizing, almost visualizing how time flies by in a human life and how God, by contrast, is from forever to forever. What happens at the end of the psalm, I don't want to leave you in suspense, is that this mention of transgressions makes it clear that this is a communal supplication. Maybe there's been a drought, maybe there's been a plague, and the speaker asks God, with an eye to the ephemerality of human life, to turn back the disaster. Okay, I will look at one last poem, and I don't think I'm going to have time to read all the way through it, but it's Psalm 104. Bless, O my being, the Lord. Lord my God, you are very great. Grandeur and glory you don. And again, that echoes the Hebrew alliteration, Hod v'hadar lavashta. Wrapped in light like a cloak, stretching out heavens like a tent cloth, setting beams for his lofts in the waters. That is, they believe that they were waters above the firmament, above the visible sky, as well as waters below, setting beams for his lofts in the waters, making his chariot the clouds. He goes on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers the winds, his ministers glowing fire. So you can see the power of mythology as it gets into the poems. God has a chariot up above us, a chariot of cloud, and then the wings of the wind impel the chariot. He founded earth on a solid base, not to be shaken forevermore. With the deep you covered it like a garment. Over mountains the waters stood. From your blast they fled. From the sound of your thunder they scattered. They went up the mountains, went down the valleys to the place that you founded for them. A border you fixed so that they could not cross, so they could not come back to cover the earth. Now, you can see here a kind of monotheistic transformation of the pagan creation myth. In the creation myth of the Canaanites, there is a fearsome sea god that tries to come up over the land. He is subdued, and a clear limit is drawn between dry land and sea. So here, that sea god known as Tanin and Leviathan and Rahav and a couple of other names, even has more than one head in one version, is absent entirely. And you just get this kind of naturalistic meteorological image of God setting a border that the waters of the sea could not cross. I think I'm going to, since I've really run on quite long, well, I'm going to read one more stretch of lines, beginning with verse 14. How many your deeds, O Lord, all of them you do in wisdom. All the earth is filled with your riches. This sea great and wide, where creatures beyond number stir, the little beasts and the large. There the ships go. This Leviathan you fashioned to play with, all of them look to you to give them their food in its season. And then it goes on to evoke God as a providential God who provides sustenance to all living things. What is particularly piquant and I think revelatory with what the Psalm poets do with mythology is this Leviathan you fashion to play with. Now, Leviathan, as you get in the quasi-mythological representation of him in the voice from the whirlwind at the end of Job, is a fearsome creature, a threatening creature. He has to be slain or imprisoned for all time. But here he becomes an aquatic pet who God can play with. So it's almost a humorous note. So I hope I'm happy to expand on any of these points in the Q&A, but I hope you get some sense of the vivid range of poems you have in Psalms and how wonderfully they convey both the anguish of the human condition of people in crisis, desperate for help, and also this wonderful, expansive vision of creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alter.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. If people have questions for Professor Alter, you can put those in the chat.
And
There's
Julia and I will relay them. It'll be easier than having 135 of you trying to talk at once.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So there's already some comments here that people have been making while you spoke. There's one from Amira about the water bucket example, sounding like the forerunner of baptism, and interested in how the water theme is so prevalent in this. I almost said the sonnets, the psalms that you chose to look at, including the Leviathan psalm and the psalm that you began with about drowning. Do you want to say more about how water functions in the psalms as environment, as symbol,
sure,
as element?
Two things. I think the water bucket has nothing to do with baptism. It's where the speaker feels he has been down in the waters, like a bucket that's submerged to bring up water, except he's going to drown. And when he's pulled up out, the point is not that the supplying of water, but the fact that he can breathe again, that he's not going to drown. I would say that in general, well, keep in mind the following. Ancient Israel, like modern Israel, exists in a semi-arid location. It's dependent on rainfall for its existence, something that's often invoked in biblical poetry. So there's a kind of ordering of water in many of these poems, where there's the waters of the Mediterranean, which of course don't sustain life. This is thousands of years before desalination, and in the breakers of the sea pound against the land and seem to threaten the land, and there are therefore repeated reassurances in these poems that God has marked a border and will not let the surging waves overwhelm the land. But then there is the water that people need to survive, and that's spelled out in some of the lines of Psalm 104, which I didn't have time to get to. So God is also a provider of life-giving water.
Harold Levine wants to know how many different individual authors you're aware of over the whole book of Psalms. How many people are writing this book, over what period of time, I guess, and how distinctive are their different poetic voices?
Well, okay, that's a many-headed question. To begin with, I can't exactly offer a numerical count, but I would assume that there are an awful lot of authors, poets operating, again, to answer the chronological part of the question, from, let's say, the 9th century BCE, that is the 800s, down to the 5th century, the time of the Babylonian exile. Now, there are some scholars who want to date a few of the Psalms very late, to the Persian period, or even to the Macedonian period. I don't think this is convincing, but there's no end to debate among biblical scholars about the dating of particular biblical texts. If you wanted a rough guess, I would say that there must be at least 40 different poets, maybe 50 different poets represented in these Psalms, possibly even more. Is there a difference in poetic style? To a large extent, no. And that has to do with what I said about at the beginning about the analogy to Renaissance sonnets. That is, these are poets working within a tradition where you use certain tropes, traditional tropes, certain set images, familiar images. So you wouldn't necessarily see a striking stylistic difference between one psalm and the other, but there are probably a few exceptions. I can't think of another psalm that has the delicacy of expression of Psalm 8. Lord our God, how majestic is your work, and so forth. And maybe that's a poet who is quite unlike the other ones. And even the grand panorama of creation in Psalm 104, with which I concluded, is rather different from other Psalms and might be the voice of a distinctive poet. But we don't know the names of these poets. I hate to say it, they're all likely to have been male, but I wouldn't categorically exclude a psalm or two composed by a female poet.
Thank you. That was beautiful. There is a question here about rhyme in Hebrew poetry. You mentioned alliteration, and maybe while you're answering that, you could comment a little bit about parallelism, because your commentary on parallelism was kind of mind-blowing for me.
Okay. There's no convention of rhyme in biblical poetry. Every once in a while, there's a kind of accidental rhyme or internal rhyme in a line, but it's not part of the prosodic system. The first rhymes in Hebrew appear in very early liturgical Hebrew poems, what are called piyutim, and those date back to the earlier Christian centuries. So there's no rhyme. And actually, since I like to tell students that poetry is a memory machine. That is, it uses certain recurring patterns to fix the words of the poem in the mind of the person receiving the poem. So in Homer, the memory machine consists of those the dactylic hexameter, which is extremely regular, and you expect it in every line of the poem. In what we're familiar with in English poetry until the moderns, it's rhyme. If you have "behold" at the end of the first line of a Shakespeare sonnet, you're soon going to encounter "cold" and "old," and that helps fix it in your mind as a memorable text. So the equivalent in ancient Hebrew poetry of rhyme, of the memory machine device, would be parallelism. That is, a line begins with a half line, and then the second half of the line echoes the meaning. So you have, say, at the beginning of Isaiah, the ox knows its master. And then the second half of the line is the donkey, its owner's stall. So you get the semantic parallelism, which is reinforced by a parallelism of rhythm. Usually 3 beats, 3 accented syllables in each half of the line. So there you have your memory machine. I would add, this is the thing I made a big deal of when I wrote about biblical poetry, that what seems to be strictly synonymous parallelism between part A and part B of the line usually involves some kind of development. some kind of heightening or focusing or narrative development. So even in that line from Isaiah, the first half, the beast knows its master. But the second half of the line, the beast knows where the master gives him food. So you see what I mean?
There are a number of increasingly technical questions about Hebrew poetry, but let me go back to one that was further up in the chat. Our friend Amira is wondering whether, in addition to the element of water that you pointed out in a number of the Psalms you talked about, whether there are other significant elements or themes or images that run through the collection. And if so, what are they? And so we can go look for them.
Okay, I don't know if I can provide a full catalog, but the celebration of God's power to radically reverse things, which is implied there is a kind of theological idea that things are not predetermined, that a seeming inevitability can be transformed into something quite the opposite. And we saw that in Psalm 13. Then there are many Psalms that celebrate God's majesty, and you have recurring images of royal grandeur. You saw a little bit of that in what I read from Psalm 104. And there are others I could enumerate, but that gives you a taste of it.
Beautiful, thank you. There's a question here from Carolyn Lyon about sacrifice and the relationship between prayer and sacrifice in the Psalms. And I was reading Nahum Sarney last night on a similar topic, talking about a kind of strict separation between the sacrifice in the Torah and then the prayer emphasis in Psalms. Can you comment on what you see as the role of sacrifice in these poems?
Sure. Until the destruction of the Second Temple, sacrifice remained central to Israelite worship, as it did to all the different cults of the ancient Near East. That is, people in that era could not really conceive worshiping a god without offering sacrifice. It's probably true that the Israelites somewhat transformed this idea. That is, there was a notion that you can pick up in some of the polytheistic texts that sacrifice was a way of feeding the gods. And you don't get that in the Hebrew text. The closest is the sweet fragrance of the burning sacrifice, which pleases God. So sacrifice is right there, smack in the middle of it. The Thanksgiving Psalms, for example, are offered in conjunction with a Thanksgiving sacrifice. I think the Psalms of supplication would also be accompanied by a sacrifice, which would be a gesture toward propitiating God. But not all the Psalms clearly are linked to sacrifice. Some of them, well, like Psalm 104 is an exuberant celebration of God's grandeur, or the Hallelujah Psalm that concludes the collection, Psalm 150, is just well, I shouldn't say just, it's a poetic catalog of the various musical instruments that one should use to praise God. So the sacrifice is there. It's not in every single psalm. What I would tentatively propose is that the fact that poetic texts were so important in the temple cult meant that once there was no longer a temple, there were certain grounds for substituting words for sacrifice. And some of those words, of course, were psalms, which are recited as part of the liturgy.
Here's a very good question from Robert Kaufman, and I'll paraphrase it. He's asking how much of a resemblance there is between the voice of the poet or poets in the Psalms and, you know, what we think about as modern lyric subjectivity. Are these both voices speaking with the same concerns and the same cadence, I guess, or are they really very different voices addressing very different experiences?
Well, I would say this varies from psalm to psalm. That is, there are psalms in which the poet, even if he uses first person singular, seems to be speaking with a collective voice. And that's quite unlike the modern lyric self. But say Psalm 8, for example, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, you get a sense of an individual human being who is looking up at the sky and taken by its remarkable beauty and sees that as a manifestation of the perfect, harmonious hierarchy of the created world. So that sounds to me more like a modern individual lyric eye. And then again, these pleas out of desperation also come from individual experience. And I think that's why Psalms have been read over the ages in ways that are very meaningful to the individual reader, because they see in it a kind of resonance of their own experience, their own experience in some desperate strait, in some dark night of the soul. And that comes pretty close to the modern lyric eye.
Beautiful. There are some technical questions here. I'm going to ask two of these, and I'm going to ask Sean to ask the last question. Is that good, Sean?
Okay.
And it's not super technical, but you need to define these terms in responding.
Okay.
One of them is about the role of chiasmus, and one is about the role of anaphora. Would you care to?
What was the second one?
Anaphora.
Anaphora. Okay. All right. Those are good questions. I think that there are certain rhetorical and formal devices that are pretty universal, because that's the way the human mind organizes things in significant patterns. So there's a lot of chiasm in biblical poetry. It's often a way to introduce a kind of cross-stitching between the first half of the line and the second half of the line. In other words, in what we all learned in school about what chiasm was, the first half of the line will go from A to B, and then the beginning of the second half of the line will pick up B and have B prime, which is a kind of synonym for the first B, and then go to A prime. Again, anaphora, you find a fair amount of it in biblical poetry, because it's an obvious way to introduce emphasis. I'm sorry that off the top of my head, I can't quote from memory an example, but it's definitely there.
All right, Julie, you want me to ask this?
Yeah, I think that's you said you had a question. I think you should get the last question, Sean.
I guess this is a question that looks forward to a few of the other talks in our series. And it's also a way for me to thank you personally for talking about Psalm 90, which is probably my absolute favorite. Psalm 90, as you pointed out, around verse 12. Verse 12 says, in your translation, to count our days rightly, instruct, that we may get a heart of wisdom. And I wonder if you could speak for just a few moments about the character of the Book of Psalms as wisdom literature, and to what extent are we invited to read it as wisdom literature, although in a sense it's not part of the wisdom literature of the Hebrew scriptures per se?
Okay. I would say that it's sporadically wisdom literature. That is, for the elucidation of the audience, wisdom literature is an international genre in the ancient Near East, and it really uses poetry to convey a sense of how you should live the good life. It does not necessarily involve anything theological, doesn't involve covenant and creation and so forth. And the three examples in the extended examples in the Hebrew Bible of wisdom literature are the book of Proverbs, which is really mainline wisdom. It tells you what to do, what not to do in order not to get in trouble and so forth. And then there are two dissident wisdom texts, Job and Kohelet, or also called Ecclesiastes, which really reject the guiding assumptions of mainline wisdom. So you have a number of wisdom psalms. The very first one is a typical example where the just man is rewarded and the wicked man is blown in. The just man is planted like a tree by the waters, and the wicked man is blown away like chaff in the wind. Now, that's a classic wisdom idea. It's an idea that Job argues against and that Kohelet doesn't really accept. But I would say that most of the Psalms are not wisdom Psalms, especially in regard to the last excellent question about the connections with the modern lyric eye. A modern lyric eye speaks out of the compulsion of personal experience. And that's very different from wisdom.
Thank you so much. You have really enlightened us, taught us, inspired us to read more deeply, to read with an appreciation for the form and the patterns and the beauty of these works. So we're very, very grateful that you're able to join us today. And I've put in the chat links to our series on Shakespeare's Psalms that begins next week. Please register for that separately, and we hope to see you again at this or other events associated with both the Shakespeare Workshop at UC Santa Cruz and the New Swan Shakespeare Center here at UC Irvine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure speaking with you.